very fortunate and honored to have Dan Leahy here with us. Strong labor advocate and just a great guy who was retired professor at Evergreen State College and former director of the Labor Center. So without any further delay, brothers, sisters, Dan Leahy.
Thanks, Billy. The firefighters, are a strong union, but you're also a leadership union. And this country, more than ever, needs a strong union that's leadership, that's talking to the problems we're faced with. I've given this talk a lot of times, and I always think about why is it I'm prepared to give it again. When we were at the Labor Center in 1983-84, the Machinists Union had just negotiated a contract with Boeing. And they had something like 45,000 workers, union workers at Boeing. And their leadership came to me and they said, Dan, we have a problem. I said, what's the problem? They said, these young workers think that Boeing gave them the wages and benefits. So what can we do about that? And so I said, you got to tell them about 50 years of the machinists organizing against Boeing, because that's where the wages and benefits came from. Boeing would let them work 12 hours a day and get no wages at all if it was possible. But it was only the organizational might, history, strategy, and tactics of 50 years of organizing that gave those workers the wages and benefits that made them some of the highest paid workers and some of the best benefits and pensions in Puget Sound. That's why. There's a couple other reasons that I give this talk. I give this talk because I think that the mobilized working class in the United States is, I think, the best thing about the United States. In fact, I think it's the thing that defines the United States. It's certainly the thing that defines the shape of American democracy. We just made a pledge to the Republic. There's lots of different definitions of the Republic because each time the economy changed, American labor has constantly decided how to organize democracy within the current political economic context. So I think that the mobilized working class is the thing that's most important to American democracy. And the representation oftentimes of that working class is unions. And I think that when unions are attached to their communities and when they promote a social agenda that speaks to the majority of the American people, it is, in fact, the only force that can confront the staggering amount of wealth and theft that's going on in the United States right now. And if unions don't speak to it, we're in more trouble than you can imagine. So for those reasons, I give this talk. I also think that it's important to talk about labor history. Most of the time when we're in high school, labor history, it was, violent. Or, that's about all we get to learn. Most of our history is about rich people, Carnegie, Rockefellers, and the rest of those thieves, right? So we don't even see ourselves in most history, right? We don't even see ourselves. We can't, in fact, even imagine ourselves acting. And one of the things about labor history is imagination. Right now we're kind of in a jam. So how do we imagine something different? Sometimes I think it's important, to cross cultures. You begin to get imagination, what's possible. Sometimes you cross boundaries, national boundaries, see what other people think about us. You can kind of imagine a different way of acting. But I think it's also possible to look into our own history, and that's where the imagination comes from, where our capacity to imagine something else. Most working class people around the world, they're trained in something called structural deference. You know what that means? That means you can't fight City Hall. Oh, that's right, you can't fight City Hall. Or if we fight the boss, that's the giving hand that gives everything. No. So, we're all trained in deferring. But in fact, all our history is not about deference. It's about defining American democracy. And that imagination comes from that. The second thing I think that's important is about acting. How do we imagine ourselves acting? And it's hard sometimes to imagine ourselves, actually acting in the situation we're currently faced with, right? But if we go back in history, we can see people just like us confronting the exact same situation we're in now. So I think, labor history is also about seeing how people acted in the past. The other thing is labor history is like this storehouse of strategies and tactics. It's like every strategy, meaning, a particular goal and how you reach it, every tactic, right, meaning what's the weapons we use to enforce our strategy, they're all in labor history, everything you can imagine. And what we need to do is take a look at all those strategies and tactics and adapt it to the situation we're in. So it is a storehouse of all the things we've tried to define American democracy and make sure that working people get a share of the wealth and benefits of this country. And frankly, if we don't go back and look at those strategies and tactics, we are blind. And we won't know how to imagine something different, how to act, or how to move in this current context. And the final thing, I think, is solutions to the problems we're faced with. What does that labor history tell us about finding solutions to the current situation? You guys are a pretty strong union. You're in the public sector, of course, and that's, bullseye for the rest of these people that want the public sector. They want to privatize it. They don't want you to have a union. They don't want you to be organized, and they don't want a public sector. But nonetheless, you guys are strong, and I think that that's really important to being able to think about solutions. Just imagine this, for instance. You guys used to get together, and in the decades, if you got together like this, you'd all be fired. Back in 1918, 1919, your international union actually had to move to Canada in 1919 because affiliation was outlawed, right? You'd be dying like flies on the job. You'd have, continuous duty 24 hours. And yet here you are, right now, being able to pull together something like 400 people and go through this packet of stuff. This packet of stuff is about strategy and tactics. It's about something like the duty of fair representation. It's about negotiations with your employer. And then there's something in here called times are changing, the political dynamics of the United States. So you go all the way from something as direct as duty of fair representation to negotiations with your employer to the context within which you're operating. All those things are in there. And one of the things I like about your union is you guys read. Sometimes I used to go to your, executive board when they'd ask me to give a talk. I said, what are you guys reading? And then I take that book and I read it out loud and then I give that talk. But this is a reading union. And so there's lots of stuff in there, and I hope you take the time to read it and talk about it throughout the day. Let me go through this talk. The first one is going to be about labor history up until the 1980s. It's called The Definitions of American Democracy, because there's different definitions depending upon the current political economy, basically how capital is organized at different times and how they're trying to pursue their interest against the interests of the working class. And so after the Civil War, we killed 600,000 of us. 600,000 of us in the Civil War trying to figure out whether this country would be based upon wage slavery or based upon slavery. Which type of force was it going to be, wage slavery or African American slavery? And in 1869, a group of tailors in Philadelphia, kind of religious people, who believed that it was possible after the Civil War to find some way to come together across class, across race, across gender, and create a new type of American democracy. And they were called the Knights of Labor, KOL. And they were formed in 1869. And they believed that it was possible for labor and capital to, in fact, get along and create a harmonious society. And they did not want society to be based upon wage slavery. The initial idea of America was about artisans and farmers attached to the land, growing their own produce, and as a result of being able to feed themselves, they could have a political voice. In other words, they could be politically independent. It was a Jeffersonian idea of American democracy, right? The Knights of Labor were a part of that tradition. They believed that you could have a cooperative commonwealth of people, farmers and artisans and workers who could have a cooperative type of society where labor and capital would get along. I asked history 4 questions. What is it that we want? Who do we want it for? How are we going to get it? With whom? That's our strategy. And how is our tactics? So what did they want? They wanted that cooperative commonwealth. Now, who did they want it for? It's an important question, right? When you guys are thinking about strategy and tactics and the political situation you're in, who is it that you want your demands for, right? Who's the we? When you talk about we, who is it? The Knights of Labor believed, and this was a common assumption in this state and throughout the late 1800s, that the actual producers of wealth were the workers, the artisans, the farmers. They called them industrial workers, the farmers at this time. That they were actually the producers of wealth. It wasn't Carnegie or Rockefeller, Gates, Allen. No, it was the workers themselves that produced the wealth, and they were going to be the we. So they had a very inclusive definition of who the we was. That meant women. That meant African Americans recently freed from slavery. That meant all races and colors. The only people they excluded was bankers, speculators, and lawyers. So they wanted a cooperative Commonwealth society, and they wanted it for those producers of wealth, and it was a very inclusive thing. The next question is, if you want that, what's your strategy? Now, at this time, there wasn't a large federal structure. So what they wanted was local government. And the question, of course, which was around in the late 1800s, was, is government an instrument of the ruling class? Or is government something neutral that you could, in fact, take to, in fact, implement the type of society you want? Still a legitimate question, actually, about your strategy about government. You go around it, you go through it, you take it over. These people made the judgment that it was neutral, so therefore you could take it over. And what was the infrastructure they wanted for that cooperative society? At this point, they wanted the railroads nationalized, they wanted the telegraph nationalized, they wanted the school systems public. In other words, they wanted the public to own the infrastructure upon which you'd build cooperatives, and those cooperatives would be the production and the distribution of goods and services. How many people are here from the Columbia Basin? Do you know why they irrigated the Columbia Basin? That was federal infrastructure to create a cooperative society. The people out in the Columbia Basin weren't supposed to be those multinationals. They were supposed to be cooperatives producing and distributing goods and services based upon federal subsidies. So what they were going to do is they were going to have the government be the infrastructure. The question is, of course, how do you take the government then? And one of the things they did, and I think firefighters can think about this in terms of your fire halls. They created these assemblies. And what was assembly? Assembly was a place that had a food co-op. Assembly was a place that you could get a decent drink of water, a healthy one. Assembly was where a working class culture taught principles of cooperation rather than competition among the working class. So those assemblies, something like 15,000 at the height of their, something like 700,000 people in the late 1800s, 15,000 assemblies. That assembly was the educational space. There's very few workers in the United States that have any space for thinking about things. You guys have the fire hall. You control that space. There's very few workers that have any space on the job where they have the opportunity to actually think and discuss this stuff. And without some type of autonomous space that the workers control, there's very little hope. You've got to have some space to think about some stuff. This conference right here is space to think about this stuff. So they built these assemblies. They used boycotts. They didn't believe in striking. But they thought that in order to take government, they had to extend the franchise. So that meant voter drives, right? Voter registration drives, extending the franchise. Because, of course, in American democracy, if in fact you have the majority of votes, then in fact you can control your government, the government builds infrastructure, out comes your cooperative society. And in order to mobilize that vote, they believed in a new political party called the Populist Party. In 1896, there was this platform called the Omaha Platform. Anybody ever hear of the Omaha Platform? sometimes I think, you should look that up. Google the Omaha platform. This was the populist demand for how you design a democratic society. Sometimes, I think we need another Omaha platform. Maybe we should all go to Omaha. Or maybe we should, maybe next time we meet, we should design an Omaha platform for Washington State and the rest of the world. The Omaha platform, it called for, there wasn't direct election of senators then. They called for direct election of senators. There wasn't a referendum or initiatives. Oftentimes, how come there's a good minimum wage law in this state? It was because labor put it on the ballot and we voted it in. That's why all those young workers make better money than most any other states on the minimum wage laws, right? That was the initiative. That was another thing that they were for, initiative. They were also for national ownership of things like the railroads, things like the telegraph, in other words, infrastructure. So they believed in that populist party. And I want to tell you that I guess everybody's here from Washington State, right? How many people are native to Washington State? Everybody. In your state constitution, you have language that says the paramount duty of the state is for the education of all residents residing therein. Public education. Do you know that? It's the strongest language I know of in a state constitution about what the fundamental purpose of the state is. It's the provision of public education, K through 12, for the public and the education of all those kids in those boundaries, regardless of class, caste, race, or whatever. That was in our Constitution when we formed this state in the late 1880s. Why is it there? Was it there because the railroads? No. It's there because there were people who believed in this notion of American democracy, put it there. That's why it's there. The third governor of our state, John Rogers, was a populist. He was from the Populist Party. In 1911, we started taking over all the ports in this state. Do you know that we're the only state that controls our ports publicly with an elected body called port districts? The reason we were there is because James Hill was coming over from eastern Washington with his railroad. He was going to pick up the commodities over there, bring them to the port of Seattle and Tacoma, and sell them when the profit was best for him. And the farmers said, no, you're not. And they got together with small business, labor in Seattle and Washington State, and they created this thing called a port district, and they took over Tacoma Port. Now there's something like 54 ports. We control the trade that moves in and out of this by elected bodies. In 1930, there was another initiative called Initiative District 1. And what did it do? It authorized the people of any county to condemn the property of eastern monopolies like Stone and Webster, take over their property, and create a publicly owned system that delivered energy at cost to its citizens. There is no other state in the United States with that institution of directly elected public utility district commissioners. Why is that? Because of this history. The people that organized municipal leagues, the fact that Seattle and Tacoma is publicly owned, some of the first in the nation. The people that organized the ports, the people put the language in about public education, the people that created the PUDs. It came out of this notion of how you organize an American democracy. I'll tell you one other thing. Districts. Many of you guys work for districts, don't you? There's something like 4,000 districts in the state of Washington. We have more districts than any other state. You know why? Because people who believed in this believed that government at the local level with directly elected people was the best way of preserving American democracy, and that you could not depend upon the state legislature because it was controlled by the railroads. So why are all these amazing number of local districts? It's because of this idea of how you organize American democracy. So what happened to this group? This group in the 1880s rose up to be about 700,000. I said 15,000 assemblies. It was the largest American union in U.S. history. In the mid-1880s, they went up against a guy named Jay Gould. Jay Gould was a person that was building the railroads going down to the southwest, down to Chihuahua, because they wanted all that copper mine down in northern Mexico. They still do, by the way. The Guggenheim fortune, if you ever heard of Guggenheim, was made up of robbing the Mexicans of their copper using Gould Railroad. So they struck that railroad, and they struck it with all the crafts. They had unity across all the crafts, and they beat Gould. Right after that, they decided to go public. They became a public body. And the second time they went after Gould, they didn't have craft unity, and they lost. You know, Jay Gould was the guy who said, I could hire one half the working class to kill the other. Do you ever wonder what, like, you know, these private military firms are when they're starting to take over our police departments? Sometimes I think about, you know, it's happened in New Orleans. It's increasingly happening where your police forces are being privatized. Nonetheless, it lost in that second, you know, strike. It lost, and then something else happened to them. And this is really interesting because it's coming up. May Day. You know, in 1884, there was this organization of trades and crafts, and they got together and they said, May 1st, 1886, the legal hours for work is going to be 8 hours. They announced it. Labor used to announce these things, you know. They announced that May 1st, 1886, workers, the legal time is going to be 8 hours. And they started organizing different crafts in 1885, 1886, 1887 to go on strike. And then everyone was going to go on strike in May 1st, 1886. You know, the world celebrates the American workers' fight for the 8-hour day. And they celebrate May Day in most countries in honor of the fight of the American workers for the 8-hour day. You know, it's interesting, isn't it? I looked at my calendar before I came over here, and May 1st, it has M. You know what M stands for? Mexico. Do you know why? Because there'll be 1 million people in the street in Mexico as a national holiday celebrating our struggle for the 8-hour day, and none of us even know about May Day, do we? Most of us don't. Hopefully, the Mexican worker will remind us about May Day. They did in March 2006, when over 1 million came out on May Day saying we're workers. Anyhow, there was this effort in May 1st to have the 8-hour day, and there was a police attack on May 4th of a crowd of striking workers in Chicago, and several workers were killed, several policemen were killed, and 4 people were hung. They're known as the May Day martyrs, the Martires de May Day, de Primero de Mayo, which you'll see on the streets in Mexico, by the way. They'll all be able to name, you know, the people that were hung, like Albert Parsons. So the difficulty there was that oftentimes when American labor gets strong, there's tremendous repression. And there was repression after May 4th, 1886. And a group of people decided that there had to be a new idea of American democracy, a new way of organizing the working class. And that was an organization called the AFL, the American Federation of Labor. And it was started in 1886. And the American Federation of Labor had a different notion of what American democracy was. Part of it's in your unions, part of it's in craft unions. It was referred to as an associational idea of American democracy. In other words, what's the basic unit of American democracy? Where is it that people learn how to, in fact, have civic virtue, how, in fact, to act democratically? Where do they learn about how to act within a democracy, how to participate? These people believed that the association was the basic unit of American democracy, and that association was craft unions. It was the bricklayers, it was the carpenters, the iron molders. That was the basic unit of American democracy. So what did they want? They wanted an associational idea of American democracy in which they wanted worker control. Now, what did worker control mean to them? It wasn't just about wages and benefits. It was about the relationship between who defines what the work is, what the product is, and what's the best way of doing it. It was the unity of planning and execution. It was a non-alienated notion of work. It wasn't that you were working for somebody else. You were working for yourself and your colleagues, and you were creating this product. You were designing it and implementing it. And that's what craft unions were about. Craft unions were about the connection between planning and execution. Now, did they want anything to do with government? No. They wanted to have a direct relationship with their employer. It was called voluntarism. And a lot of the AFL unions were opposed to any type of government regulation of unions. They didn't want government to enter into the relationship with the employer. They wanted a direct relationship with the employer. And how did they want to get that? They wanted to get that through an economic strike, and they wanted to embed their gains in the collective bargaining contract and in the bylaws. Now, what did that produce for us? You know, you have an education seminar here. I'm really glad it's called an education seminar. A lot of unions are about training. And I don't have any objection to training, but training assumes that the goals are clear. And the thing about unions is that the goals of the unions, how to reach the things embedded in the Constitution, that's up for discussion. You know, I mean, I was at some union meetings recently with the electricians. You know, it's really interesting to watch American workers talking to each other, debating things, deciding upon things, motions, all that stuff. I mean, that's rare in the United States, where working people get a chance to actually figure out the goals they're going to pursue and then discuss strategies and tactics. Self-education, apprenticeships, self-education, that's really important. And plus, the 8-hour day. The 8-hour day wasn't given to us by the government. The 8-hour day was defined as something needed by American labor, and they said they were going to do it, and then they did it. That's the way the 8-hour day came about. Now, it was embedded in law later on in 1938, but that's not its practice. That law simply legitimated existing practice. We were already practicing the 8-hour day before 1938 in many unions that were organized. What happened at the end of the 1880s? The American political economy switched. It was no longer this small regional scale democracies, regional scale economies. It was now a national economy. The railroad had connected it, right? Countrywide, continent-wide. It now had national markets. If you have national markets, you can have national scale industries. So what did you have? You had Carnegie controlling steel. You had Rockefeller controlling oil refinery, right? That's the way he became rich. He didn't pump. He controlled the refining of it. He had 9/10 of oil refining capacity in the United States by 1900. So you started to have these large industrial institutions. And there were people that began to say, you know, we have to have some new organization other than craft unions. We have to find some way of dealing with these huge corporate national institutions with nationwide reach. So there was a group of people that came together in Chicago in 1905, and they're called the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW. And what did they believe in? They believed that it was possible to internally democratize these large-scale institutions, that workers themselves would in fact organize within these large-scale institutions, that once they controlled those institutions, they would confederate at the top. You know, a lot of American ideas about how to organize things are about confederation. You know, they're about organizing across of autonomous units, you know, like the Articles of Confederation, some of our initial ideas about how you organize. The Wobblies believed that once you took democratic control of these, confederated at the top, and that confederation would decide what's produced and what's distributed. It was called industrial democracy. It was something that started in 1905. It didn't really gain its strength really until the 1930s, did it? When the industrial unions organized. But here are the Wobblies in 1905 saying, industrial democracy is the way, in fact, we should control these new institutions. Who they want it for? They want it for all wage workers. Anybody that worked for a wage. Anybody that worked for a wage, didn't make any difference what your sex was, color was, race was, whatever that was. If you were a wage worker, you can, in fact, join our union. So they were very inclusive. You know, when I was looking at the kind of old history articles, I'd see this OBU all the time, and I always wondered what OBU meant. And OBU meant one big union. They called the AFL the American separation of labor. They believed that workers had to have one class consciousness and they were going to organize one big union. And once they organized that one big union, they were going to have this type of cooperative society. So what were their tactics? One of the interesting tactics, of course, that most construction union guys know, although I'm not sure they know the origins of it, is called wobble the job. You know what wobble the job means? Anybody? Wobble the job is, one guy described it as the technical withdrawal of worker efficiency. It's kind of like, let management do it and see what happens. If we withdraw our mental skills, if we withdraw the way in which work's organized from the workplace, things go to shit pretty quickly. So wobble the job simply means work to rule. It means withdrawing our mental abilities to, in fact, make this thing work to rule of management. And of course, that's an immediate way of slowing down or internal strikes or striking on the job, which was used by lots of unions in the 1980s when they realized the strike environment was no longer available to them. They struck on the job and they learned their history about wobble the job. It's called internal strikes or strike on the job. And then once you wobble the job, then you would have a general strike. And that general strike would come your industrial democracy and your confederation. Now, what does this stuff mean to us? It means a lot to us here in the United States and certainly in the Pacific Northwest. You know, one of the things was, you know, when I first was joining a union, it was a laborers union. And, you know, I was pissing and moaning about having to pay $95 to get in. This is like 1961 or 2. And this guy from Kashmir, great big old boy named Jim Sanford, taught me a couple things. One was about controlling the job. He said, if that supervisor comes over the top of this ditch and he wants to talk to us, I want you to stand on your shovel and we'll talk to him all day long. Because we're the ones that decide when we work, how fast we work, what the speed is, all that other stuff. So if he wants to talk to us, I want you to stand on your shovel. But nonetheless, I stood on my shovel. Second thing he said to me was, the great thing about unions is that you can say whatever the hell you want, make any political statement you want, and the boss can't fire you for it. Because unions are about the workers' ability to have free speech. And I believe that. I believe that. I think it's really important that unions enforce free speech. You know, there's a lot of liberals in this country that say, boy, you know, workers don't care about free speech. I said, you want to walk into some corporation someday and see what they do to you? The only time they have free speech or can speak up on the job is if, in fact, they're a union. So the Wobblies taught us about free speech. They also taught us about the Seattle General Strike. You know, how many people know about the Seattle General Strike? Good. The Seattle General Strike was in 4 days, February 1919. They say it was, they set up a general strike committee. It came out of a strike by shipyard workers. It kind of came up from the waterfront. You know, it moved 60, 70,000 workers on general strike out of a population maybe of 130,000, 200,000. That general strike committee, nothing moved in that city without the permission of the general strike committee except the tide. It was the only time that the American workers ever went to stage 2 of revolution. You know what stage 1 is? Basically, it's a general withdrawal of labor. Stage 2 is the temporary substitution of governmental authority. The General Strike Committee in Seattle had governmental authority for 4 days. The third step, of course, is the permanent replacement of workers for the authority of the state. That's called revolution, one definition of it. That was the definition at these times. So, Seattle 1919, it set off a strike wave in the United States. Imagine this one. February 1919, the Seattle workers go on strike. They hold the city for 4 days, and they initiate a strike wave that had almost 5 million workers in the street. 1/5 of the American workforce was on strike from through the year of 1919 until the police strike at the end of the year. Now, what was that about? It was about the question of who benefits from war. Because World War I had just ended, And there was a question, as there always is after war, who benefits from the American workers going over there and sacrificing their kids for the war? And the American corporations who had profited tremendously under wage freezes during World War I came back with this thing called the American Plan, which meant no more unions. And the workers in Seattle, the steel workers in Chicago, the mine workers in the South, the United Mine Workers, and then the police and firefighters in Boston. All the way through that year they struck, they said, no, it's time for the American workers, in fact, to have a piece of that. And no, we're going to keep our unions, and no, we want wage increases, we want benefits, and we want pensions. You know, it's really interesting, in 1919 I noticed, in 1919 you guys had your second international conference in Portland of the firefighters. And you know, in this, I can remember the part of your Power Through Participation binder, which I hope you have, you know, there's a thing that says in 1919 the International Association of Firefighters demanded universal health care. Interesting, isn't it? Demanded universal health care. I actually never saw that reference before in any other union, but there you are, right? 1919 saying we need universal health care. So that strike, nationwide strike, it led to tremendous, again, repression. They hit the Wobblies, they raided their offices, they put 5,000 people on ships going back to Russia even though they weren't from Russia. They did. It was amazing, called it Buford. General Palmer, A. Mitchell Palmer, who was the Attorney General under Wilson, issued the Red Scare, started saying American workers better keep your head down, we're going to put you in jail if you join a union and the rest. And so there was tremendous depression, and as a result of that, there was another shift in the economy. Mellon came in as Treasury, he started soaking the poor, allowing the rich to go on a spending spree, opening up credit accounts, speculative investment, and all the rest, and out came the Great Depression in 1929. And in 1929, a bunch of people in an organization called the Committee of Industrial Organizations in 1934, led by a guy named John Lewis, who was the head of the mine workers, he said, you know, we've got massive unemployment. Our banks are closing. People have lost their deposits. We need some new form of organizing. And so you know what they said? We're going to organize unions industrially. We're going to build industrial democracy. That's why it's called the Committee of Industrial Organizations. As a result of saying that, they were kicked out of the AFL, and they created their new organization in 1937 called the Congress of Industrial Organizations. It was a separate union. Now, what did they want? They wanted some notion of social justice. Now, you know, that social justice was really kind of a two-part thing. They wanted people who were employed in these new industrial plants. Now it's not the railroad that's dominating things anymore, right? It's General Motors. General Motors is now the largest industrial corporation in the world. They wanted workers there, you know, to have unions voice wages and benefits. But they also wanted something for the poor, all the unemployed. You know, you had massive unemployment councils. You know, the unemployment councils that reached something like 300,000 members, it started out of Seattle in 1932-33 and spread nationwide. So they wanted some type of social justice solidarity. They wanted it for the industrial workers, and they also wanted it for the poor. And the question is, how'd they go about trying to get that? Unlike the AFL, who still opposed asking the federal government for anything, the CIO wanted the federal government to step in. And they wanted to step in with several different acts. The first thing they wanted was the Wagner Act. How many people here know about the Wagner Act, 1935? Do you know, up until the time of the Wagner Act in 1935, if you organized a union, you were a wage conspiracy. You were a criminal conspiracy. The Wagner Act, for the first time, was federal recognition of the American workers' right to organize a union. They had to, you know, the employer had a responsibility to respond to that union's demand in a fair way. That was the first time, right? The Wagner Act, 1935. When John L. Lewis started organizing workers in 1936-37, he said, the President of the United States wants you to organize a union, wants you to be a union member. You guys should pick that up again, I think. You know, you want to organize a union. The President wants you to join a union. The Social Security Act. The Social Security Act in 1935. How many people have ever been on unemployment? Nobody's been on unemployment here? It's amazing. The reason you can go on unemployment, the reason you can get it, by the way, you pay into it. You know, somebody tells you it's not yours by right. No, it is. Social Security Act of 1935 was a thing that set up an employment compensation system at the federal and state level. It was a thing that created a place for, you know, mothers with dependent children so they wouldn't have to starve. It was the first place where senior citizens could, in fact, have a pension, right? Just imagine, for instance, if we had privatized Social Security under Bush, how many senior citizens would be in the poorhouse right now? That Social Security, that system came out of the Social Security Act in 1935 because it wasn't just, look at, you guys have a wage, right? But you also have a social income. It's not, you don't just survive on a wage income, you survive also on the social income. You survive on the things that are provided through a public system. You eliminate public services, you eliminate public schools, you eliminate public health care systems, your wage goes down because that social wage is a part of your living standard. These guys believed you had to have both a wage income and pensions, but you also had to have a social income. And that's where the Social Security Act. Fair Labor Act, they basically came up and said, you know, things like the 8-hour day, 40 hours work, stuff like that. They were already being implemented. I wanted to mention a couple other things while we're on this economic, but I'll get into the second part of my talk. You know, they passed the Utilities Holding Company Act. That regulated all the monopolies in the United States, national monopolies. That's why, you know, it was possible for the consumer not to be gouged with rates because they didn't want these monopolies to, in fact, be able to gouge consumers with rates for your basic utilities, right? That's why they're called public utilities. They're not publicly owned, but they're publicly regulated. The other thing that was passed at this time, you know, was interesting, was this Glass-Steagall Act. The Glass-Steagall Act lasted from 1935 to 1999. You know what it did? It didn't allow commercial banks to enter into speculative real estate deals or buy speculative investments, right? It kept them from doing that. In 1999, all those brakes were taken off, and guess what we got? But in 1935, they knew they needed to regulate those commercial banks, and they had this thing called the Glass-Steagall Act of 1935. So, of course, they wanted all these things, and the question is, how do you get them? You know, when they had a railroad strike in 1877, it was the first nationwide strike, the railroad workers. Because the 4 railroad owners in the United States got together and said, all at once, we're going to lower the wage to every railroad worker in our lines. We're going to lower the wages to everybody. And so the American workers that were working on that railroad, they did several things. They said, well, we're going to withdraw our labor. Will you talk to us now? And the 4 railroad bosses said, no. Well, we're going to soap down the tracks and stop the rails. You going to talk to us now? No. Okay. We're going to take all of the produce and all the commodities off those rail cars. We're going to empty them and distribute it to our families. You're going to talk to us now? The railroad owner said, no. They said, okay, we're going to shove those engines into those depots all across the eastern seaboard, and we're going to burn them to the ground, which they did. And they said, you're going to talk to us now? No. Those 4 railroad guys said, no. In fact, we're going to call up the federal troops that were enforcing Reconstruction and the possibility of democracy in the South and bust your unions. And that's what happened. So for 50 years, there's this question about, can the American worker get some position on capital so they, in fact, have to talk to them? And in the winter of 1936-37, workers began to sit down inside this huge industrial plant in Flint, Michigan. And they held that plant, of course, with the possibility that if they didn't get their demands, there'd be a lot of destruction going on. But they also held it and they connected to their communities so that when the police came, they couldn't separate the workers and their demands from the broader community, because that's oftentimes what happens, right? You go on strike, right? The police come in, They do their best not to let anybody else know what's going on, what the workers are asking for. In Flint, they were able to maintain that thing because the Women's Emergency Brigade was the mechanism that kept communication going between the workers and the community. And the Women's Emergency Brigade were probably more important in that winning that strike than, in fact, sitting down. But nonetheless, the combination of those two is what made it possible. And what did that mean? That meant that a group of 160 workers, probably the majority of whom were spies for GM, beat General Motors, and out of that came United Auto Workers of America. Not only the Auto Workers of America, but the rubber workers and all the industrial unions that organized through the late 1930s and 1940s. So they did that by a combination of federal demands, sit-down, and strikes. What came out of that? The industrial unions. This state was known as the Soviet of Washington. Why? Because we were so heavily unionized. This state was the most unionized state in the United States. At one point, we had almost 40% of the workers in this state were in unions. Why was that? Because we followed that industrial model. Whether you were a newspaper guild, longshore, woodworkers, or whatever, machinists union, Teamsters, we were a highly industrialized union state here. And out of that came a lot of things that made this state livable and possible for the American working class. What happened to these demands? Just the passage of those laws, of course, sometimes they get it back, like, why did workers, let's see, oh, I know. FDR gave workers the right to organize. Yeah, FDR gave them the Social Security Act. Yeah, FDR gave them the... No, that's not the case. The idea that old people should have a pension when they're no longer working, it came out of a guy named Dr. Robert Townsend in California who had this thing called the Townsend Movement. The Townsend Movement was demanding that senior citizens have a pension when they can no longer work. It didn't come out of FDR. FDR was a multimillionaire from New York. Where did the idea, that the industrial workers should in fact have these, rights? It came out of the CIO organizing. They were the ones demanding it, right? That's where it came from. Where did the idea of sharing the wealth, in other words, Roosevelt's actual policy of taxing the wealth and having a progressive income tax in some way, where did that come from? That came from this governor, of Louisiana called Huey Long. Huey Long had a thing called Share the Wealth movement. He was organizing a union party for the 1936 election. He was going to challenge, Roosevelt. See what I mean? These ideas came out of us. That's what shaped the New Deal. I remember one time, I was doing a oral history of Washington State, and I went around and found people who had participated in all these strikes in the 1930s, and I bumped into this one old boy. I don't know how old he was. He was still in really great shape. And I said, let's see, in the 1930s, you guys were out implementing the New Deal. And, his veins, came out about like that. And he said, we weren't implementing the New Deal. We were creating the New Deal. The American workers created the New Deal. They also, by the way, created the economic theory that got us out of the Depression. And I think it's worth, at least thinking about what that economic theory was. Again, it didn't come from John Maynard Keynes, the English economist known for Keynesianism. It didn't come from Roosevelt. It came from the American workers figuring out how, in fact, to distribute one of our geniuses, really. You look at union constitutions, it's about distribution of goods and benefits to everybody in this industry that's working. So what was the economic theory? The economic theory was if you want to stop industrial warfare, which is currently going on, you have to, A, give us a framework within which we can talk to the employer without trying to beat them to death. 2, you have to give us some wages and benefits so that we don't have to, go on a fight to keep our families from starving, right? And you have to create a floor below which no one would fall. And then when you produce these things, we'll be able to buy them. It was just that simple. Think about today, right? $700 billion going to the banks. Why didn't they give the $700 billion to us? Why didn't they say every time there's a stimulus package, that package has to be prevailing wage, it has to be that person has to join a union, right? They have to build mass transit, public health care systems. Why don't they give that stuff to us? Well, they gave it to us because we demanded it in the late 1930s, and that's why there was an American working class, middle class in the 1950s. Because we created these institutions, right, that allowed the American worker to have some piece of what they produced, a modest amount of the productivity that they have, and allowed us to buy our way out of the Depression. I don't think, by the way, that it was about the war, World War II. I don't think that. I think we were getting out of the Depression without the war. I think we were getting out of the Depression because of the demands we made. In 1938, they started saying no more of that New Deal stuff. We're going to go to war. But the New Deal stuff created by the American worker was getting us out of the Depression. Okay, so what happens to us after the war? 1945, 1946, the largest strike wave in American history. Why? There were 8 million, we had lost 500,000 workers over there in the fields of Germany and Japan. We had 8 million veterans coming home. We had beat the fascists. We had beat the Nazis. We now want, homes. And it's amazing how much the American workers ask for. They don't ask for much. We don't ask for much. Homes, a decent job, education for our kid, some type of future, some type of pension, so when we're not working, we were not going to be in poverty. They wanted those things after World War II. And they went on strike to get them, nationwide. And there was pushback. Pushback by who? Association of Manufacturers that had made millions off of the war. And what did they want? What did these workers want? They wanted wages and benefits in the future. But they also believed that it was possible that all these plants, the shipyards, Boeing, those things were built by federal dollars. So what did the workers want? We want a share of those plants. We want some shares in those plants. We want to control what those plants are going to produce now after the war. We want some of that. We want a 30-hour week. We want equal pay for equal work. We want those things. We want money to be invested in the United States, not over in Europe. After World War II, the United States had all the liquidity in the world. They had all the money. We still had an in-place infrastructure. The American workers wanted that, liquidity, that money. They wanted that reinvested inside the United States. And there was this debate. Are we going to do the Marshall Plan or are we going to do that here at home? So there were all these different issues. They also, by the way, wanted the South to be organized. My dad, who was a Teamster, told me that, Dave Beck, a lot of people, he was a real estate guy. Some people think he was a criminal, but he was also the head of the Teamsters Union. But one of the interesting things my dad told me that Dave Beck, the reason they put him in jail out there on McNeil Island is because he planned to organize the South after World War II. And when I was doing the Teamster education project for the Teamsters, I was looking through their pictorial book, and there's Beck in the South surrounded by black workers because he was going to organize the South because the South was unorganized. So industrial labor, they wanted to organize the South too after, why? If you don't organize people with lower wages, your wages are going to go down. Simple as that. Simple as that. You got to lift those folks up or you're going down. That's called class consciousness. It's also called good strategy and tactics. But nonetheless, there was a fight about that, right? And there was a political fight about that, and they went after the unions, and they attacked the unions. And they kicked out unions that were in the CIO who were saying, no, we want the money at home, not the Marshall Plan. Yeah, we're going to organize the South. No, you're not. All this stuff. So to make a long story short, there was this deal. I call it a social accord. It's an understanding about how America is organized. It's an understanding. And it came out of 10 years of fighting called the McCarthy era, Red Scare, whatever you want to call it. It was a fight between labor and capital. It wasn't a fight about the Soviet Union. It was about a fight of whether or not American labor is going to get the rewards of the war they fought. That's what it was about. It wasn't about whether the Soviet Union was communist or going to rule the world or whatever that shit was. It was about the demands of American labor after World War II, in my mind. So there was a deal made in 1955. And the deal was symbolized by the fact that the AFL and the CIO came together. That's where it started, right? 1955. That's where the AFL and CIO joined. And when they joined, it symbolized a particular accord or understanding that they had with labor, with capital. And the accord was something like this. You will give us ever-increasing wages and benefits. You will recognize our unions. You will bargain with us in good faith. And in exchange, we'll no longer demand our wages and benefits come out of profits. See, after World War II, they were demanding for inflation-free wage increases. What did that mean? That meant that wages, those increases came out of profits. If they don't come out of profits, where do they come from? Increased prices. Where do increased prices affect? The rest of the working class. It's a beautiful way to separate the working class from themselves. Initially, they said, no, we want it out of wages. So they said, okay, after World War II, we'll just take it out of prices. We won't talk about profits anymore. The other thing said was, we're not going to talk about planning anymore. In other words, how we design our workplaces. You know, somebody told me, not told me, but mentioned in their questionnaire, they said, does the auto workers have some blame for what's happened to GM, United Auto Workers of America? Do you think the United Auto Workers of America decide what's produced there? Do you think they decide what technology is introduced? Do you think they decide whether or not to produce a sub or a mass transit system? What, do they decide those things? No, they don't decide those things. So no, I don't think they have any share of what GM is about. And by the way, GM hasn't made money on its autos for years. They only make money off its financing arm, GMAC. That, by the way, is what your taxpayer dollars went to, GMAC, not the auto industry, but to the financing arm. Okay, so the American workers say, okay, we're not going to say anything more about profits. We're not going to say anything more about how we should, in fact, plan this work. You know what that's called? That's called the Management Rights Clause. And practically every contract after World War II, there's a thing that says Management Rights Clause. The workers are bargained for wages and benefits, but the rest of the stuff, the introduction of technology, the planning of the workforce, the design of the place, that's in management's hands. Okay, so they there's one other thing, and that is when the American military machine goes overseas to open up markets, you send your sons and daughters. So what did that mean? That meant a lot of things. It meant that there was a substantial middle class in the United States. It was primarily for the male wage earner that was a union. But nonetheless, the American working class, quote unquote, was the envy of the world. They had won significant struggles. The housing, ownership of private housing skyrocketed. The number of workers covered by private benefit pension plans went up. The wages and distribution of goods and services, that went up. The ability of the American worker to consume things outside the workplace, incredible consumer society. So, did we win a lot of things at that time? Yes, we did. Were there people that were not a part of that deal? Yes, there were. So, what happened in the 1980s? Or actually, 60s to 80s. What happened there? There were some people that were left out of the Wagner Act. Who was left out of the Wagner Act? All the public employees? They weren't in the Wagner Act. All the farm workers? They weren't in the Wagner Act. So there were a lot of people that were left out of the Wagner Act. There was also some difficulties in American society, such as massive legal discrimination against African Americans, a major portion of our workforce. There was also wage and category discrimination against all women. They got a lot less wages, and they were also categorized in particular industries and weren't allowed to go into other occupations that might have made higher wages. So there were people that were in fact left out. And in the 1960s, John F. Kennedy kind of signed an executive order signaling the right of federal workers to be involved in collective bargaining, and that signaled states to also begin organizing. So what did you have? You had a public sector beginning to grow in the United States, public sector unions. It was made up of government workers, but the other thing that's important to remember, they were made up of not only government workers, but government workers attached oftentimes to the people that they serve. You guys probably see poor people more than anybody else. You probably see unemployed more than anybody else. You're going to increasingly see veterans more than anybody else on the street. You see those things, just like teachers. Teachers see those kids coming to school. They can tell you exactly the state of American society. I'm sure you guys can too. So the public sector workers that could see that, right, they moved with the disenfranchised, the people that were outside of this deal, post-World War II deal. And they did it with the civil rights movement, and they did it with the women's movement. And you all know that Martin Luther King was killed in 1968 because he went down for a wildcat strike of garbage workers in Memphis, Tennessee, right? And the people that picked up that strike, Jerry Worf, William Lucy, who's still the head of AFSCME, they started moving across and organizing workers that had been left out and workers in the public sector. And and your union, of course, was a part of that. The Public Employees Relation Commission that was formed in 1973, 74, 75, I think 75 implemented, you know, that's a part of your collective bargaining structure. Before that, you didn't have one. You didn't have the right to collective bargaining. So, what did that mean? It meant, for instance, that the public sector right now is the largest unionized sector in the American workforce. Something like 34% of the American public workers are union. It's the largest sector within the AFL-CIO. It's, I think, the last break against the corporation's interest in privatizing all of society and turning every possible interaction in society based upon whether you got money or not. So I think the public sector unions, you know, the public sector union is the largest within that is government workers. Do you know who the largest within the government workers is? Local workers. Who's the largest within the local workers? Protective services. So if you don't think you're on the front line, you're on the front lines, right? That's what we got out of the public sector, and that's currently kind of where we're at now. I want to just kind of conclude this part with a few thoughts about what all this means to all of us. First, I do think that, I mean, it is amazing to me, really. I mean, like almost 400 workers here with a couple of days to talk to each other about the situation they're in, not only work-wise with their employers, but in society itself. I mean, that space to think, that's fundamental, and it's something that unions give workers. You probably all of you have worked non-union. You know better than to talk to another worker about a wage, about the situation they're in. You know, it's the last thing you're supposed to talk about, you know. Why? Because the employer's going to get rid of you. The importance of imagination. You know, we're going to have to, use our imagination to get out of the situation that we're in. And in order to do that, we need to spend a lot of time on education. And that's why, this is so important. By the way, you guys are professionally, internally disciplined. I know that. You've got procedures you follow. You learn them. You're constantly updating them. You have to use that same internal discipline to stop and think about the situation you're in and ask all these young people in this room to do some reading and some thinking about the situation they're in so they, in fact, will have a future and can learn from you about where the wages and benefits come from. I guess the other thing is, which sometimes I remember the AFL unions at the turn of the century, you can't pretend that things haven't changed. I don't think this is some type of, modest downturn in the American economy. I think this is a fundamental change going on here. And I don't think we can say, oh, we'll just, hold on here. It'll be all right in a moment. They're always saying Wall Street stocks are up. Oh, good, good. What's that have to do with us? Not a lot, because they go down the next day. So they're trying to, fake us into thinking, when I see some dollars actually flowing to all those people with foreclosed homes or to all those workers that are unemployed, have you ever, apparently you're not unemployed, never been unemployed. If you're ever on unemployment and they say that there's unemployment available to you and it's extended, try calling up that phone number. Try getting through. Of all those workers that are on unemployment, something like 37%, I think actually less, actually get benefits. So I don't think we can pretend that the world hasn't changed. I think we have to, there's this rule, number 7, you have to keep the enemy in front of you. You, in fact, have to see the enemy because there's no strategy without two sides. The other thing is political self-respect. That's something that the Wobblies had. And what does that mean, political self-respect? It means you have a thought about the worldview. You actually have a vision for the type of society you want. If you don't have it, you're going to be delivered somebody else's vision. So I think it's important to spend some time thinking about that. Please don't give up on your public infrastructure. Everybody wants to take away the public sector. You know, if you take away the public sector, in my mind, especially public education, public services, any of that stuff, I think you take away democracy. You'll be dependent upon the free market system, and that will be it. There'll be no brakes on it, no regulation of it, no ways out of it. So please hold on to your democratic, public institutions. I think we have to do a lot of research and strategy about finance system in the United States. I think unions are the ones that have the research and capability of doing that. I think we should keep working across racial and gender lines. There's been no advancement of the American working class without crossing racial and gender lines. It simply doesn't happen, at least in what I've seen. I also hope that you'll think about speaking for the left out. That's been something that the public sector has done. It's one of the ways the public sector unions organized. You know what you guys were doing during the 1930s? Your union halls were places that were the soup kitchens. Your firefighters used to go out and knock on doors and find out who needed help, who was stranded in their homes. So I think, thinking about the left out. So that's my first talk. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming back. Okay, I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes, hopefully. And I'm going to talk about basically my idea about how we got into the financial crisis that we're in, and then look back at labor history and come up with some ideas about how to get out of the current situation that we're in. So, the current situation is 5.4 million jobs lost August 07, since August 07. 600,000 lost in March. Unemployment claims, in all these questionnaires and stuff I got, unemployment in all these counties. Yet only 37% receive unemployment benefits. 1 million foreclosed homes in 07, 2 million in 08. 1 out of every 10 mortgage holder is in default or in foreclosure as of September 08. That's a record. Estimate of 1 out of 9 in foreclosure by 2012 due to negative equity, meaning they owe more in their house than their house is worth. All of us know that our household wealth, home equity loans, the price of our home, which oftentimes is the source of wealth for the working class in America, pension funds, 401ks, deferred comp, they're all going down. They haven't lost an amazing amount of wealth. There's a massive loss of worker wealth and social income. And that's just kind of a beginning of the situation that we're in. And what happens? A guy named Hank Paulson, former CEO for Goldman Sachs Investment Bank, one of the major architects of the financial boom and bust that we're currently experiencing, goes in as Bush's Treasury Secretary and says to the United States Congress, I want $700 billion. I don't want any judicial review, and I don't want any strings attached, because we have to bail out these toxic assets. And so the Congress votes $700 billion to this guy, no strings attached, and he starts passing it out. It's interesting that the act under which that $700 billion was given to Hank Paulson says something about helping out the American homeowner in foreclosure and helping them to prevent future foreclosures. So one of the things I did was I started tracking that money. 16 banks here in Washington State have got almost $1 billion. You know any of those banks? 16 banks in Washington State have got almost $1 billion. Have you heard it funding your public health systems? Have you heard it expanding your fire districts? Have you heard it making it more possible for you to service the people you bump into every day with paramedics or firefighters? I don't know. Has anybody noticed that money? I haven't noticed it. I haven't noticed a dime come into a foreclosed house either. I'm doing a film with a Swedish filmmaker on foreclosures in Thurston County. Those people haven't seen a dime of that money. So I started looking at that money, and then these people down in Oregon called the Rural Organizing Project that organizes rural families in the counties, rural counties of Oregon, asked me to come down and give a talk about how we got into this financial situation and how to get out. And I said, how much time do I have? And they said, you got 15 minutes. So I made up this chart in order to do that 15-minute talk. And I'm going to spend a little bit more time doing it. But this is what I want to argue. I want to say that after World War II, the United States created an economy, a manufacturing economy, that was based upon the mass production of consumer goods and services. And in the mid-1970s, that mass production manufacturing economy became too expensive for the owners of that economy. Profit rates started going down, and they began to reorganize that economy in order to create wealth. And what they organized in place of that manufacturing economy that produced goods and services and had union wage jobs and paid for pensions and created the American middle class was an economy based upon finance capital in which the production of goods was replaced by the production and sale of paper representing debt. That shift took about 4 decades. And what I want to do is to go through each decade and tell you how I think that shift took place, what it meant for us, and then the second part of the talk is to go through how we get out of the current situation we're in by looking back at how we acted in the past, in our own history. So that's what I'd like to do, and I can do that till just before noon. So here's this chart's in your packet. And I'll go through it fairly quickly because I've talked on a little bit of it. So in the 1970s, the post-World War II industrial system had a series of shocks. I call them shocks. The first shock was massive social movements in the United States that delegitimized the current structure of the United States. There was the civil rights movement that said this country was fundamentally racist and enforced legal segregation throughout the North and the South, and that had to be broken. There were anti-war movements that said this country can no longer, afford to, nor is it appropriate that they spend millions of dollars and send kids over to Vietnam to guaranteed markets into China. The women said, you guys are not paying us a legitimate and equal wage, and you're not allowing us to go into different occupations. So there was a women's liberation movement, anti-war movement, civil rights movement, Black Panther movement. So there were all these movements that delegitimized the current idea of the United States as a just and progressive system. At this time, the late 1960s, the corporation CEO was the last on the ladder in terms of public understanding of someone doing good. They were the lowest level of public popularity. The other thing that happened was, besides the legitimacy crisis, there was the oil crisis. There was the Arab oil embargo that began to raise up the price of oil. There was the Iranian Revolution in 1979 that overthrew the Shah, which was a major source of Mideast oil. There was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and Afghanistan is a corridor for both gas and oil down to Karachi. So all of a sudden, the United States, which had been organized around the production and consumption of oil, highways, cars, the rest, that's the way we made our money, that cheap oil is now threatened. And if you threaten your energy source of your production system, you're threatening your production system. So people were worried about cheap oil. The third thing was about military supremacy. Since World War II, the United States military was able basically to open up and protect markets worldwide for U.S. corporations. The U.S. war in Vietnam signaled the fact that that idea of opening up markets in that particular manner was not only costly in terms of money and lives, but no longer efficient for U.S. capital. So there were these series of shocks that went through the 1970s. Those shocks led to American business leaders forming a new organization because, in fact, think about this. If you want to act differently, you have to shape your organization differently. They began to shape their organization differently in the way they were going to relate to the American state. And it was called the Business Roundtable. It was set up in 1973. It was made up of the 200 largest publicly held corporations in the United States. And they said, we have to have a direct relationship with government. We're not going to do this interest group politics anymore. We want a direct relationship with the U.S. government. When Reagan came to power in 1981, there was a direct correlation between the Business Roundtable's agenda that had been developed in 1970 and Ronald Reagan's political power. And when those two matched, you got the 1980s. And the 1980s began with the PATCO, firing of the PATCO workers in 1981, and the signaling to labor that they were going to be under attack by every U.S. corporation. And were they successful in damaging the construction trade and industrial labor in this time period? Yes. Did they initiate a whole series of concessions in this time period? Yes. Was the American living standard started to go down from that time on? Yes. Have we recovered since? No. So was there, an attack on labor? Yes. Was there an attack? Think about this, right? I mean, after World War II, what did we get? We got organized labor, a regulated capital system of monopolies, and a social welfare floor. What did they come after in 1980? They came after that deal. They attacked labor, and then they went after regulated capital. You know what the 80s were. Deregulation. You know what deregulation is about? Deregulation is about raising, it's about lowering our living standard. If you allow those corporations to be unregulated, to do whatever they want without any regard to the public interest, we get screwed. Deregulation is against our interests. We set it up to regulate that capital so they wouldn't, take advantage of their monopoly situation, raise up their prices, and make our living standard go down. So what was Reagan about? Deregulation. By the way, if you deregulate, you eliminate the notion of a public interest. So what did 80s become? What can we do for the corporations? That was the only question. How can we help American corporations? There was no more any discussion about public interest. Wait a minute, this country is about the public interest. It's not about the corporate interest. Yeah, corporations are a part of it. Small businesses are a part of what we talk about. But, this is about the public. That's what American democracy is. It's not about corporate interest only. In the 80s, it was. And what highlighted that? Deregulation. And then the third thing was eliminate the social welfare floor. We had the federal right for women with children to have aid to their families. That was eliminated in 1986 by Bill Clinton, called the Personal Responsibility Act. So were they, in fact, attacking unions, regulation, social welfare floor? Yes. Do you know one of the things that came out in 1980 was this plan, because you know what they said why American corporations couldn't compete overseas? They said it was because the public education system was all screwed up. Really? Oh, you mean it's those little teachers down there and all those little kids? They're the ones that, make it impossible for us to compete in the world? A, they're not interested in competing, and no, it wasn't the teachers and those kids. No, but what did they do? The public education system is a $600 billion market. It's called the final frontier of the public sector. You want to know why you hear all the stories about public education and teachers, they're all being screwed up and don't help your kids and all this other stuff? It's because corporations want that market. And Lehman Brothers, before it went out of business, did a report in 1985 which divided up the functions of public education by investment sector. These series of corporations are going to train teachers. These series of corporations are going to run schools. These series of corporations are going to evaluate the product afterwards and whether or not they meet our market needs. That's what all this privatization is about, right? And that's why they're after the public school system, and that's why they're after the public school system in this country. And by the way, if you want to know who runs the public education system in this country, go look at the reports of the Washington Roundtable. The Washington Roundtable, as far as I'm concerned, is the Board of Education of this country. And by the way, they do not need trained, educated workers for their plants anymore. And they say that in their literature. So did they come after unions, deregulation, social welfare floor in the public sector? You bet. It was called privatization. And they came after it. Somebody mentioned about how you began to shift away from manufacturing sector to a finance sector. The head of the Federal Reserve at this time was a guy named Paul Volcker. Have you ever heard of Paul Volcker? He currently chairs Obama's Economic Advisory Board. Paul Volcker was a guy who raised rates up to 13, 14, and 15% during the 1980s. You know what that meant to the manufacturing sector? It meant that my friends who were all steel workers in Pittsburgh watched the whole steel industry just collapse. Right? There was no retooling, no reinvestment. The raising of that interest rates was, in my mind, a direct attack on the manufacturing sector. Why? Because what are they doing here? Right? They're changing the way the economy is organized. So those interest rates, went up. I think they were about attacking the manufacturing sector, which, by the way, at that time, of course, was where industrial labor was, where the heart of the labor movement was. It's where the working class had gained the most victories from capital. Okay, so then what do? Reagan passes this Tax Act in 1986. And what did the Tax Act do? It took everything that we had fought for all the century long, that we had in our wages, we had in our benefits, we had in our ability to regulate capital, we had it on our social welfare floor. They took all that wealth and they put it into the hands of the wealthy. They did that through Reagan's tax policy in 1986. What did that mean? It meant lowering taxes on capital and pushing the tax burden down on the states. Now, in the 1950s, federal revenue, about 30% of federal revenue came from corporations in the 50s and 60s. Now it's down to maybe 5, probably less percent. So what did? They took the taxes off, which meant more wealth to them, and they put the tax burden down on the state level. And of course, you all know what's down at the state level. It's not wealth tax, it's not progressive income tax, it's sales and property tax. And who pays sales and property tax more than others? The poor and working class. So if you shift the tax burden down on the state and local level, you're automatically creating a regressive tax system. So, all right, so they attacked the post-World War II deal, unions, regulations, social welfare floor, public education. They put us all on the defensive. They raised the interest rates and attacked the manufacturing sector and at that point, they started deconstructing the manufacturing sector and began sending it overseas, the manufacturing sector. Where am I? Okay, so what's that mean? That means, and I'm not going to go through the stats, I can read them for you if you want, but basically our wages stagnate. So what do? We get 2 people working. It's called the 2-family earners now, right? You have to have 2 people earning in order to maintain the living standards of the 70s. And even with 2 people working in the 80s and 90s, we had to borrow more money on our houses in order to keep our living standards. So our wages stagnating, you bet. What's happening to the wealthy? In the 1980s, the 500 richest families identified by Ford, their net worth tripled. Right? I mean, it just was this incredible theft of our wealth, our social wealth, up to the top, and a diminution of our political and social power. So what happens finally at the end of the 1980s is that the Soviet Union implodes because they're dealing with the same economic situation that we were, basically a production system that's too costly. It implodes, and all of a sudden the globe is open for American capital to expand. So I want to give you just a small example of what happened in the 80s, so you can see, most of you know it, happens in the 90s. So it's called the savings and loan debacle, right? A lot of union people lost their pensions in that savings and loan debacle. So the savings and loan, Ronald Reagan signed this legislation when he first came to office in 1982, saying it was the most significant piece of financial legislation in the history of the United States. What it did basically was it deregulated the savings and loan industry. This industry in which people would give, they would give money to a savings and loan. The savings and loan would, lend it back out at a higher interest rate than they're paying, and people would be able to build their homes, right? That's what it was. And they were heavily regulated in terms of making sure that the only thing they acted in was in the interest of the depositors. In 1982, all of those restrictions on savings and loans, in other words, where they could in fact loan, now they could loan nationwide instead of in their own community. What it took to set one up in terms of the number of investors, that was eliminated. You could actually make one up if you owned a piece of land, you could have a savings and loan. What the interest rates you could charge, the ceiling's the limit, whatever you want to do. If you want to invest in speculative real estate, you can do that now too. They did all of those things, and what did that mean? That meant $1 billion bailout by the United States government, the taxpayers, at the end. And by the way, that's still being paid off by the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, still dealing with that debacle back then in the 1980s, right? So all of that, and by the way, what was it called? The Federal Savings Loan Insurance Corporation, they abolished it. The thing that used to insure the Federal Savings and Loan, it was abolished. The Federal Home Loan Bank, their governing board, abolished. Now, what else was abolished, of course, was millions of dollars of pensions, bank accounts, savings, all of that, right? This is just a beginning of what it meant in the 1980s. Okay. So what did the 1990s do for us? When I give talks around, they say something like, what's neoliberalism? Because neoliberalism is a term that's used throughout Latin America. Actually, it's used throughout most of the world to describe what took place in the 80s, those sets of policies. But there's no reason for me to have to explain neoliberalism to any American worker, because every American worker knows what it means. I know it. I don't have to explain it to any Irish person, because Irish people know what free trade means, or neoliberalism. It means that you can't control your food supply and you starve while they're shipping food commodities out of Ireland. It's because you can't even control your own food supply because the English control it. So meanwhile, you're starving in Ireland and sending millions of people over here are starving to death, and they're shipping foodstuffs out of Ireland. Right? So neoliberalism is about a whole series of policies that took our wealth away. It meant attacking unions, deregulating capital, eliminating social welfare floor, and attacking anything that had public sector in it, any notion that you had a relationship other than a wage or income one. So what did they do with all of that victories that they had in the 1980s? They put it into something called trade agreements. Do you know what trade agreements were? Trade agreements embodied all the things of the 1980s. That's what they were. But they were primarily financial agreements. They were things that said, you have to, if you sign this thing, or we want you to sign this thing because you're going to have to denationalize your entire financial system, right? Denationalize it. That means that American capital come in and they can buy your banks, they can buy your credit systems, they can buy your insurance companies, they can buy your stock market. And when you sign this thing, by the way, if you sign it, we'll let you send some textiles or foodstuffs into the U.S. market. That was the deal. It was signed in Marrakesh in 1995. The first one, of course, was NAFTA, signed in 1994. It was a whole series of trade agreements that basically took all of these victories of the 1980s, put them into trade agreements, and sent them around the world. You don't want to know why half of the debt that, there's something, the IMF recently estimated that there's $4 trillion worth of toxic assets in the world, half of which is going to have to be written down by banks in the United States. The other half is going to have to be written down by banks throughout the world. Why? Because these financial agreements, right, were inside those trade agreements. That's what those trade agreements were doing. They were opening up. They were taking off all governmental measures that allowed for the flow of capital, that allowed for the selling of these toxic assets. So that's why, when they're talking about this being a global crisis, that's why it is, because all the national brakes on U.S. capital and European capital coming in and out of their countries at lightning speed were taken off when they signed these trade agreements. That's why they're able to do it, and that's why we have a global difficulty. What happens finally at the end of the, what are we at? At the end of the 1990s is the end of the Glass-Steagall Act. It was called the Financial Modernization Act. Now, you know, Glass-Steagall was passed in 1935. It basically said that commercial banks have to stay attuned to the interests of their depositors. So they couldn't engage in speculative investments. They couldn't engage in real estate investments. They basically had to pay attention to their depositors. When they got rid of the Glass-Steagall Act and allowed commercial banks to unify with investment banks, to unify with insurance companies, to unify with real estate, you had the integration of this thing called the FIRE industries: finance, insurance, and real estate. They were all together in one entity. You know, they talk about things being too large to fail. These things were created. It didn't just happen. They were created by taking off all the restrictions that we built on finance capital in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and 60s. In the 80s and 90s, all of those things were taken off. I mean, the finance industry spent billions, I mean, I could give you the exact figure, maybe it's on the chart, billions of dollars in order to fund lobbyists, in order to make political contributions, to take all these protections off. It was a design system. It didn't just happen. This was a system that was built from the 70s, 80s, and 90s and built into financial trade agreements that they sold throughout the world and forced on other people to participate in. This is another thing I wanted to mention in this particular context. There's this article called The New Wealth Machine. And I saw it in a book by Kevin Phillips. Kevin Phillips is a really interesting read. He has this book called Bad Money. I recommend it to you. It's in paperback. Maybe you could read it in your fire hall and talk about it. He referenced this article called The New Wealth Machine. And it basically said that there's no reason anymore to take finance and build new plant and capacity. That's all secondary. You don't, in fact, need to employ people in the production of goods and services. You don't need to create this consumer society. You don't need to create social goods out of production. That's all secondary. You can make wealth directly. And how do you do it? You securitize, meaning you create a paper for every income-producing asset in the world. And right now, only 40% of the world's income-producing assets is securitized, meaning that there's a piece of paper that has some claim on that income. So how do you make wealth? You create paper. You securitize it, right? You create these different financial instruments based somewhere on that income-producing asset. And then you take that financial instrument, like a mortgage-backed obligation or security, you create a collateral-based obligation, then you create a collateral debt obligation number 2, and then you get AIG to insure it all, a AAA rating, and you sell it throughout the world. There's no reason to invest. You want to know, I mean, they're not investing in the manufacturing sector. You can see that the way Obama treated the head of GM. I mean, you know, he said, okay, Mr. GM, you're out the door, bye-bye. Did he do that to one bank? No. Did he do anybody in Goldman Sachs? No. JP Morgan, Chase, any of those people? No. But somehow he tells the guy that's in charge of, you know, maybe it's a failing industrial machine, but nonetheless it represents the last manufacturing piece in some ways of the U.S. economy. Sorry, you're out the door. So I think that this new world wealth machine, or this new wealth machine of securitizing, creating pieces of paper and selling it across the globe, in fact, became the ideology of the 1980s. It was the way, in fact, the way people became enormously wealthy. Now, did we become enormously wealthy as a result of this? No. Did a lot of people become wealthy? Yes. Why? Because none of this comes down to any of us, because they don't need us for any of the production of any of this paper, any of these mathematical formulas, or any of these instruments. We're simply not a part of that process. So all that wealth is at the top. Meanwhile, we're still stagnating wages down at the bottom. All right. So what happens in terms of financial sector dominance? They come to the fore pretty much in 2000, 2001 with the attack on the World Trade Center. There's nervousness about the American economy. Alan Greenspan goes into the Fed and he reduces the rate down to practically zero, the rate at which banks can borrow money or investment banks can borrow money. And all of a sudden, there's this enormous amount of liquidity, money in the system. And in my mind, they chose the housing market as a way to accumulate wealth. And how did they begin to use that housing market to accumulate wealth? The first thing they did was they went out and began selling financial products to people that had been previously, I think, discriminated from the housing system. Basically poor, minority, people of color. They began to sell these things called subprime loans. I mean, something like 20% of all mortgage originations in the 2006 was subprime loans. It simply meant you had to pay more in order to get a mortgage. And by the way, reports coming out increasing said that 50% of all subprime loans that were sold were in fact sold to people that could have in fact gotten prime loans, meaning cheaper rates. But the people selling these things for Countrywide and other things, they were selling them at the riskier they could sell it made. So subprime loans to begin with expanded the market. Then what did they do? They had so much liquidity and so much money they made, they had to find ways of convincing people to buy a house. Now, the three people I'm interviewing for this film, were they interested in buying a house? No, shit, they didn't think they had enough money to buy a house. So they go look for a rental. Oh, but you can buy this house. Really? Yeah, wow. Creative income. No, it's creative financing. Really, creative financing. Yeah, there's such a thing as an interest-only loan. There's, in fact, a thing called a negative interest loan. You know what a negative interest loan is? A negative interest loan is something that says, yeah, you have to pay $1,000 in order to pay for this house, but in fact, you only have to spend $500 a month. The other $500 goes on the back end of your mortgage, adds to the principal. Jesus, people say, well, shit, for $500, I can I can buy this house. And they did. And then what? About 3 years later, they got a letter from the mortgage company saying, oh, by the way, your cap has been reached. You now have to pay $2,300 a month. And they're out the door. They lose their home. So were there predatory lenders here? Yes. Were they making more money the riskier instrument they could sell? Yes. I mean, a lot of people say, look, Americans are all greedy. I mean, I don't think actually Americans are greedy. We're always told we're greedy. But, were people out there promoting these things and convincing people that they can, in fact, do this? Yes. And by the way, were they selling the ability of these people to buy a home? No. They were selling the ability of these people to refinance. Because that's what they would say. Oh, yeah, 2 years from now, look at that house down the way, it was, $100,000 last year, now it's, $200,000. You have so much equity in your home, you can refinance your way out of this, get a 30-year fix, no problem. And that whole system was based upon the assumption that housing prices were going to continue to go up. And one of the reasons, because we weren't getting wages, the American people, you know what they did? I mean, 90% of all consumer debt in this time period was off home equity loans. Home equity loans. Can you imagine what's happened to the American people? Not only losing the price of their home, but losing their ability to consume and still having all that consumer debt on something like that? I mean, it's extraordinary, the theft that these bankers, predatory lenders, investment houses took from us. And are they helping us out in any way? No, they're not. They're not even willing to make a judgment about whether these toxic assets are of any value. They still keep handing them money. Okay, so what happens? Housing prices, those subprime loans, all of a sudden some of those people can't afford that anymore. They can't refinance, and foreclosures start hitting records in 2007 and 2008. The price of housing, it starts flattening out. What are all these debt instruments based upon? This mortgage-backed securities, these collateral debt obligations 1 and 2. What are they based upon? They're based upon the assumption that housing prices are going to continue to go up. When it flattens out, everybody's in trouble, and they all start taking calls. Oh, and who do they make a call on? Their insurance company, AIG. What did AIG do? All these guys had all these different toxic assets, so to speak. They said, hey, AIG, you're going to insure this, right? AIG says, hey, no problem. Give us this fee. We're going to put a AAA rating on that thing, which is what they did. So when housing prices flatten, foreclosure starts coming up, all these people start saying, hey, AIG, give us some cash. AIG says, we didn't save any money because, of course, we assumed housing prices go up, so actually we don't have any money to give you. So the whole thing starts coming apart. And one of the first things it did, was they started bailing out AIG. They thought that would stop it, $86 billion with Timothy Geithner and a couple other people in New York Reserve Bank. And they gave AIG $86 million, $86 billion. Did that help? Not really. But who did it heal up? It has this thing called counterparties. I can give you the list of the counterparties. The counterparties were the people that AIG insured but didn't put any money in case something went wrong. So that $86 billion went to Goldman Sachs, Bank of Scotland, JP Morgan, all those banks, right? Those investment banks that were using those things. So where'd that money go? Right there. Did it go to any of us? No. Okay. So in the mix of all that, $700 billion comes in. And I basically want to tell you what the argument is, and then I'll move on. And you can think about this and see what you think. Because the current administration under Geithner is saying that the difficulty is that these toxic assets, these financial instruments that were based upon housing, mortgage-backed guarantees, mortgage-backed obligations, collateral debt obligations that were sold off that. They mixed mortgages, credit cards, auto sales. They sold them. That those assets now that are worldwide are undervalued, right, because there's a liquidity discount. Liquidity discount means that there's not enough money in the system to allow those things to get into a market price and be sold and everything is all right. And why is there a liquidity discount? Because there's a credit crunch. Remember they had that? They said credit is jammed. There's a liquidity discount on those prices. If there was liquidity flowing in the system, if there wasn't a credit crunch, if there was liquidity flowing in the system, those things would be priced on the market, it'd be sold, and we'd all be good. So how do we deal with that liquidity discount? We give money to banks. We give money to investment banks. We send that $700 billion, something like $560 billion has been sent to banks so far, no strings attached. We send all that money into the system. The Federal Reserve starts putting money into the system, $1.2, $1.7 billion into the system, along with that, right? Trillion, excuse me, into the system. Everybody's waiting for this, liquidity discount to disappear, and all those assets will be valued and be sold. Okay, so that's one argument, and that's what's going on. It's subsidizing banks in order to put liquidity into the system. Liquidity discount disappears, these toxic assets will get valued, and everything will be right with the world. The other argument is that the reason the prices on these financial instruments are either unknown or are low is because they fundamentally have no value. That many of the banks are basically insolvent. And the more you waste time sending money in trying to deal with this quote-unquote liquidity discount, the less time and money you're going to have to, in fact, right the system. And the way to right the system is the way we've always done it, which is to bring in the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, have them look at the banks, liquidate the ones that are insolvent, and conserve the ones that aren't, put money into it, and recreate a new financial system. Now that's basically the argument that's going on in the Treasury. And if you ever get a chance, please listen to a woman named Elizabeth Warren. She is the chair of a thing called COP, Congressional Oversight Panel. It's copsenate.gov. She puts out amazing reports. She's also on video. She is one of the most articulate, I think, spokespersons or, educators, I guess, about what are the choices that we're facing. Okay. So what I want to do is just look back at our history and make some comments about how we might think about this stuff. Part of our state's history and part of U.S. history is based upon this Farmers Alliance that came out of Texas in the 1870s, came all the way to Washington State. It's probably one of the reasons that our state has so much populist institutions in it, was this organization of farmers. And of course, they were dealing with a situation in which there weren't any central banks. There weren't any credit. So what they had to do was they had to get their money from the merchant that supplied them with seed. It was called the crop lien system. They didn't make any money. The merchant took over their land. And they lost a lot of land in the South based upon that. So the populace and these farmers were very interested in the financial system. And they designed a financial system that they called the sub-treasury plan that they promoted throughout the United States. And one of the reasons we have a Federal Reserve System, which is actually a private banking system, semi-private, in 1913 was because the populace were demanding a national system, financial system that would provide workers with credit so they could produce and live in the United States. And one of the things I wanted to say about this particular movement is that they weren't afraid to say that the public sector, publicly owned things are in fact important. If you guys don't believe in the public sector, you won't be able to defend your jobs, your practice, your profession to the rest of the community. If you want to save those things, you have to stand up and say the public sector is important. I'll tell you why. Not only for firefighting, but I mean, you know, a universal health care system, man, you guys need that. You know you need that from your work. So, I mean, I don't think we should, you know, these guys were not afraid to say things about public, and thank God they weren't, because we have a, you know, energy system, a port system, a public school system here that came out of their thinking that said the public has to do it. Yeah, I mean, even your profession. I mean, they were burning cities down in Seattle and Spokane. Why? Because those water systems were owned privately and the keys were in the hands of private people while those things burnt. Okay, so I think, you know, we should think about, not be afraid about public systems. I also think, I mean, I know that, you know, you've got a lot of specific things to do here, but I think we have to think about finance. I think you guys have to think, we all do. We have to think about how to create a financial system that actually benefits us, whether it's credit unions, shifting our money to credit unions that hold our portfolios rather than selling them off, you know, in financial instruments, or however we decide to do that. We have to figure out a way that the savings that we're currently having is actually used for things important to us and our families and our future. That money, you know, they're all worried about us now saving, you know. Oh my God, American people are starting to save. Well, it's not just about saving. It's about how we use that saving for our own purposes, for improving the health of our communities, our families, or whatever. I think we should think about cooperative ways of doing that in some way. But nonetheless, the question of our savings is really important. And there's something like 8,000 credit unions. There's this movement in Portland called Fire Your Bank. It's basically, you know, saying move your money from these institutions that got all this TARP money into credit unions. Why? Because credit unions actually, you know, help maintain your housing portfolio at the minimum. All right, Depression era movements. We talked about the Depression era in some ways, but look at, not only was there a wealth tax and regulation of capital, which I'll talk about, but look at, what did Roosevelt do with banks? Roosevelt created a bank holiday. He closed the banks. And then what did he do? He sent in federal, examiners. If the bank was in fact insolvent, like probably a great deal of our banks today are, he liquidated it. They liquidated the bank. They sold off what they could. They sold whatever assets they could. They liquidated it. They closed it. They eliminated it. If a bank was in fact possible, and had some assets but some liabilities, but in fact could get out of it, then the federal government invested in that bank through like they're doing now with preferred stock ownership. But what did they want with preferred stock ownership? They wanted voting rights on the bank. They wanted to be able to remove management. They wanted to have senior rights to the dividends and dividend policy. And they wanted, policies about who they're going to lend to in a way that would in fact get us out of the Depression. Are we doing any of those things with this money we're handing out? Not one. We're not asking for voting rights. We don't remove management. We don't have any voting control. None of that stuff. Did they do that? Yes. So is there a lesson there for us? I think so. But nonetheless, they did those things. Public employment. I mean, there's all this stimulus money. The Works Progress Administration, and many of you have probably seen those workers, incredible works of art, which are called bridges and other public things, the CCC and all that stuff in the 30s. They're still around. They employed 8 million people. 8 million, it's the largest public employer during the Depression, 8 million people. I mean, frankly, I think we're going to have public employment. You're going to have to demand it, I think. People are. I mean, I don't know you are. I think we're going to have to demand public employment. This, stimulus stuff, I mean, I see all the lists. You can get the list, by the way, of every, stimulus package ready to go in Washington State. If you want to, I'll send it to you. But what does that mean? Does that mean, union wages? What does it mean? Does it mean long-term employment? Does it mean any type of, environmentally friendly construction? Does it mean Bacon, Davis-Bacon, stuff, prevailing wage? I don't know. It doesn't seem to. But I think we might have to think about public employment. I wouldn't be afraid to think about it. And even public employment in the creation of a universal health care system in some way. I mean, okay. So World War II, I talked about this some. The CIO after World War II, they wanted to have a tripartite system of governance in this country. They wanted to have labor, government, and corporations on planning the economy. Right now, there's billions of dollars being sent to banks and investment banks, and we don't have a say in it. We have to start demanding a say in this money, of how they're going to use it. Who's it going to? I mean, Elizabeth Warren says she can't tell where that $520 billion went. The banks don't tell you. I went to my local bank. I said, you guys got $25 million. What are you going to do with that money? They said, oh, well, what would you do with your money if you got $25 million? I said, we're going to hoard it. And when Washington Mutual needs to sell some of those branches, we're going to buy them. We're under no obligation to, do anything with this money. Did you read the legislation? I said, yeah. I said something about helping foreclose homes. Oh, we don't have any foreclosed homes on our book. So I thought, the other thing about that, I think, which I've mentioned before, I won't reiterate it, you got to protect the public sector. You got to protect it and expand it, not privatize it, not diminish it, and you have to work with other public sector unions to save it, because that's one of our only ways out of this thing, is, I think, expanded public sector. And if you expand the public sector, by the way, you have to find a way to finance it other than on sales tax, because that's what they do to us, right? They say, oh, you want health care? Raise the sales tax. Sales tax, of course, falls heavily on the poorest people on the least disposable income. So you got to find some way of, taxing the wealth, which is what Roosevelt did initially, not heavily, but nonetheless there was that idea. Okay, during the Vietnam War, I was, that was my generation kind of, and there was SDS and there was Black Panther Party and all that other stuff. But when I saw massive demonstrations and stuff in the 70s, I really thought it was the mobilization of a counterculture. I think it was a counterculture mobilized. And the counterculture was actually had an ideology of trying to build community relations with your neighbors, community relations with across race, class, gender grounds. It was about, the construction of a community in some way. It wasn't about consumption. It wasn't about competition. It was about some notion of building community. Any union needs to have direct relationships with its community. When it acts, in my mind, it has to have solid links to that community. Everybody lives in that. Everybody, your wives, your husbands, your kids, they're all in that community. That community is really important to you. I think it's about building that community in some way because, I hate to say it, but we're faced with a New Orleans situation here. You all know what happened in New Orleans. No one showed, other than, Blackwater. No one showed. And they shut down every public system, and it's still shut down. Their public housing, 5,000 units, still closed. The only public hospital in the major emergency ward for all the South, Charity Hospital System, closed. Public school teachers, eliminated. Bill Gates and the boys went down there to start private, charter schools with their foundation. I mean, they went down there and they sacked the public sector. They even sacked the police department, They have, private security firms down there. Distinctive Shooting International, made up of former Israeli commandos. I mean, they sacked the public sector down there, and no one came for those people. Now, the only people that are going to come for us are you guys. You are the nation's first responders. You're going to need to be able to operate within an expanded public sector in order to do your job in some way, in order to be available when all of this stuff is, this is trickling down. You can see it, right? You know it. More unemployment, more poor people, more people shooting up their families. So I think there's got to be more and more an understanding of the community within which we operate. The global movement, we won tremendous victories against finance capital. We really did. We shut them down. I mean, organized labor, young people, anarchists, kids, they shut down Seattle. The World Trade Organization in Seattle in 1999, November, it hasn't gotten back on track. Why? Because it was illegitimate to begin with. The bargain they were saying to the rest of the world was illegitimate. That bargain was, let us come in and take all your financial systems, and we'll let you, send some textile or food to the U.S. market. Well, we didn't let them send any of that shit to a U.S. market, and we took over their financial system, and now they're in debt holding all these toxic assets. And their whole public sector, is decimated. You want to know about Mexico? I mean, I'm sorry, but we went down there and we sacked Mexico. We took their land, we took their telecommunications system, their energy systems, their oil, their petrochemical systems. You want to know why Mexican people come here? Because we sacked their country with free trade agreements. So that's, not just Mexico, of course, but the rest of the world. So is there a global situation here? Yes. And do we have to be cognizant of the international situation that we're in? Yeah, I think we do. I don't think we should give that up. I mean, I know we have to take care of our community, but we also have to think internationally and globally. It's a big task, but I think that's what we have to do. Let me conclude with a few comments. So one of the things I'm doing is I'm organizing in October in Portland a Northwest gathering on the economic environmental crisis. And if any of you would like to get on the email list or think your locals might like to participate, let me know. My information is on those charts. Second thing, there's an article in your pamphlet called Silent Coup. It's about the financial situation. It's one of many. It's not, the best in the world, but I hope you'll read it. Think about it a bit. I mean, one of the things he points out in there is about the Social Security system. One of the things I didn't mention. I mean, they're going to come after the Social Security system. They just got pushed back a little bit. They're still going to come after it. I think we should demand that the eligibility gets lowered, right? That the Medicare system gets expanded to all citizens. Not give it up. Expand it. I mean, how are you going to, in fact, employ more and more young people if, in fact, you don't provide some space with them within the economy? So anyhow, read the article. I guess the final thing is what I start out with, is that I do think that you are a leadership union. You're strong, you're well organized, you're in the public sector, which I think is central, and you have a lot of legitimacy to act. But I think you have to act, facing your community and a much broader public sector. But nonetheless, I think that you have to use that in some way, and only you guys know, along with your executive board, how best to accomplish that. And I guess finally, if I can be of any help in any of this, I'd like to be helpful, and thanks very much for the invitation.